he and I and Michael worked very closely together in all our early publications and researches. Achim is the youngest ever professor appointed at Stuttgart University and had his own institute, Institute of Computational Design. And from there, his publications and research projects have become internationally renowned. So please welcome Achim Menges.
Oh, sorry, just need to.
They're not allowed to use those adapters anymore, so let's see which one are you.
I already put it in. Done? Fantastic. Thank you. So ready. Thanks for the introduction, Mike. It's always a great pleasure to be back here. Actually, it's quite a strange feeling to return to the school and sort of be on this side of the kind of pedestal. But I also enjoy actually coming here because you are probably the most knowledgeable audience that I tend to speak to. So this is the research that I'm going to show is very much situated within the kind of realm in which you in the MTech program actually work, and it's kind of spinning off some of these ideas into a kind of context where we actually really investigate that on the level of longer term projects. So basically what I'm trying to do in this short lecture is introduce somehow the underlying conceptual framework of our research, and then I will sort of try to exemplify that through a kind of more detailed explanation of the of 4 projects actually, because I think the kind of interesting aspects are only revealed if you spend a little bit more time on it rather than just showing final results. So in many ways, our research embraces a particular contemporary condition of architecture. And I think while one can argue that the separation between the processes of design and making, which have really dominated architecture design thinking since the Renaissance, are still largely intact in practice, one can also already sense that a new understanding of the material in architecture is beginning to arise, where the material can really be rediscovered through the computational. And as design computation no longer seems to be limited to the kind of binary realm of the digital, it can become a kind of intense interface towards the far more complex domain of the physical. And I think this is interesting because it opens up the possibility to no longer conceive of materials as kind of passive receptors of a kind of predetermined or pre-designed form, but rather as a kind of generative participant in the design process. And this probably presents quite a radical departure from both, on the one hand, the kind of tried modernist truths to materials, most infamously proclaimed by brick whisperer Louis Kahn, and the dismissal of sort of materiality and materialization altogether, which is quite emblematic for the previous generation of digital architects. So instead of that, our approach finds its conceptual roots in the processes of becoming in nature, which we call morphogenesis. So natural morphogenesis, as you probably all know, is the process of ontogenetic growth and evolutionary development that derives the complex organization, structure, and shape of natural systems from the interaction of, on the one hand, system-intrinsic material capacities, and on the other hand, the external influences, forces, and energies of the environment. And this leads to quite a profound difference between the fundamental characteristics of biological systems and the kind of established logics of technology as they still very much pertain to architecture. So instead of an assembly of monofunctional, highly optimized individual parts made from a vast range of different materials, as in technology and architecture, biological systems really consist of a very few components that are made from only a very small number of basic materials that achieve their outstanding functional integration, performative capacity, and material effectiveness through morphological differentiation, which is the kind of summary process of each element's response and adaptation to its specific environment. Another really striking characteristic of natural morphogenesis is that obviously formation and materialization is always inherently and absolutely inseparably related. And this is quite in stark contrast to the usual way of thinking about architecture design, which is still characterized by a one-directional and hierarchical relationship that prioritizes the definition of form, structure, and space over its materialization. So I think one could argue that since the Renaissance, the rising separation between the processes of design and making have led to a conception of materialization as something that is more facilitative rather than generative in character, and of materiality, as previously mentioned, as a kind of mere passive property of shape. And this is still very much the case today, maybe particularly since the advent of digital design. So over the last 10 years, our research has focused on the development of a quite different, more integrative approach to design computation and digital fabrication, based on actually a multidisciplinary approach that entails working together with structural engineers, computer scientists, material scientists, and a lot with biologists. And it's really an approach where computation and materialization are conceptualized as something that is inherently and inseparably related. So as mentioned today, what I will do in this presentation is actually go through 4 research areas that we are investigating, and rather than showing that on a kind of abstract theoretical level, I will actually back this up with 4 related projects. So looking at materiality, materialization, material structure, and ultimately material performance. So the first chapter really focuses on materiality and investigates how new technologies enable the integration of material behavior in the design process, and thus allow for this kind of understanding of material, not so much as something that is just sort of there to receive a kind of predetermined shape, but rather something that can become a kind of generator in the design process. I think it's also interesting to see that this approach is not limited to kind of exotic building materials or sort of expensive manufacturing processes, but that it can actually be employed in a context of very low resources, and it can even unfold new possibilities from very common materials, as is the case with wood, which is arguably one of the oldest construction materials we have. But unfortunately, due to the kind of the demands of standardization that are superimposed on practice, it has really been dumped down to mainly kind of dimensional sort of construction element, which is probably most emblematic in the US, where you don't call a piece of wood anymore, you just call it 2x2, 2x4, sort of disregarding of the kind of fascinating internal cellular structure of wood, which actually is the kind of driver for its behavioral characteristics. So all our projects that look at this kind of integration of design computation and materialization really begin on the microscopic level, where we investigate the particularities of the material. And it's very interesting to see that on this level, wood can actually be described as a kind of natural fiber composite material, where the cellulosic microfibrils function like fibers that are reinforced in a matrix of lignin and hence hemicellulose. And what is also interesting is that in this way, wood actually shares quite a lot of characteristics with what we know as synthetic composite materials, such as glass fiber, which are characterized by high strain at failure, which means they have relatively low stiffness combined with high structure capacity. And this is interesting because these material characteristics are well suited for construction techniques that employ the elasticity of wood to physically compute more complex shape. And this was investigated in the first project I will show a little bit more in detail, which was a collaborative project of researchers and students from our institute and the Institute for Building Structures and Structural Design, run by Professor Knippers, who is a structural engineer. So this is also an example of how such a kind of collaboration can work. All the projects that I will show are typically one-year projects, so all the research, fabrication, and sort of execution, construction happens within the time frame of 1 year, and it's a kind of collaborative effort between teaching and research, usually bringing together 5 or 6 PhD researchers and 10 to 15 graduate students. So at the core of that project is really the awareness that any material has the ability to compute form. And a very good example of that, which you can see here, is the specific figure that a strip of plywood finds once you expose it to a very simple input. As you can all imagine, if you pull on the one support point, which is really just a kind of linear translation based on a given force, you actually get the relatively complex Elastica curve for free. What's also interesting is that this so-called Elastica curve is actually overlaps in certain geometric regions quite closely with the catenary curve. Despite the fact that this is an interesting material behavior and allows you to actually shape simple pieces into complex geometry and that they can have a structural advantage, this behavior is hardly ever used in architectural design. And this is because architects can simply not draw or model such material behaviors, and that means that they can usually not design with it. You cannot draw an Elastica curve and then expect the material to do that. You have to have different techniques. So it doesn't come as a surprise that there are only very few examples of such elastically bent architectures, as for example the vernacular architectures of the Madan people in southern Iraq that really construct their houses from elastically bent reed bundles, taking advantage of the pre-stress in the elastic bending process to stabilize the houses. Or, for example, the timber cradles that were developed by Frei Otto in the 1970s at his institute in Stuttgart, that are initially assembled as entirely planar, regular wooden lattices. But once they are checked up just at a couple of strategic points that you can see in the bottom image here, they find their structurally stable double curved form completely by themselves, based actually on the elastic behavior of the wooden elements. So following a conversation we had with Frei Otto, our project aimed at further developing this kind of lineage of bending active structures within the context of today's technologies, starting actually with a series of correlated physical and computation tests. So from this kind of calibration or creating this kind of interface between the physical and the computational allowed to define a basic material system that consists of planar strips. And as you can nicely see here in this simulation, it is kind of a simple system where these two strips are initially formed by a global sort of bending induced by the translation of the support point, and then they're kind of connected in differential distances so that a tensile strip region holds the other elastically bent region in shape. That's something you can see here. So along the length of the strip, tensile and elastically bent regions actually alternate and keep each other in equilibrium. So this is what we call a kind of behavioral system, which then actually needs to be transferred into a construction system, which was done here kind of in a fully computational manner, basically exploiting the possibilities of the machine to be used. In this case, the ambition was to do the entire project with one machine and one tool only. It's not difficult to detect that there's one critical detail in this construction, a detail that probably most structural engineers would initially say is actually not working. And this is the kind of joint point of the two strips, where the structural depth actually is reduced to almost zero, and which induces obviously a severe weak point in the structure. However, we found a way to sort of distribute this kind of local weak spots so that it does not compromise the stability of the overall system. And this is done by letting these kind of joint points oscillate along the structure, which you can nicely see in the paper model, but also in the real pavilion at the end, which means that there's not a kind of single axis of weakness. And that means that here, sort of the irregularity of the structure really becomes this driver for stability. And that then became sort of the input for the computation design process, which was really only about distributing these joint points in space, because everything else is taken care of by the material itself. And this distribution needs to have a high level of irregularity, as you can nicely see in the kind of 2D mapping of the spatial distribution at the bottom here. And this was then also again verified with an actual material simulation, which shows this kind of similar behavior. So you translate all the joint points, you bend the strips initially into a global shape, then you connect them according to the joint definition points, and then they find a structurally stable equilibrium state. So I think what you can nicely see in this simulation is that the final shape of the pavilion is really a kind of equilibrium state of all interacting elastic elements, so that one can really say that here the employed material computes the pavilion's geometry. Of course, this structurally required irregularity then results in more than 500 geometrically different parts, which is not a big deal when you actually can use digital manufacturing processes and you have a kind of relatively streamlined connection between the design model and the fabrication. And then what is probably more interesting and what is, I think, quite fascinating is that the substantial intellectual investment in developing the design and design computation and simulation processes results actually in a surprisingly simple and cheap system. Here, these planar strips just need to be actually connected to the joint points, and then they find the shape that they need to take completely by themselves. So in other words, even in full scale on site, the material itself computes the shape of the pavilion. And this kind of equilibrium state of the final pavilion unfolds, on the one hand, quite an architectural space, quite a kind of unique architectural space, which with a kind of very specific sort of architectural performativity, but at the same time, it's also very efficient with the employed material resources and has a high level of structural performance. So in fact, the entire structure, which had a diameter of more than 12 meters, could be constructed by using just very, very thin, actually just 6.5 millimeters, which is a kind of quarter of an inch, birch plywood pieces. And this super thin skin is at the same time the load-bearing structure, which actually in all these cases also has to fulfill the quite stringent requirements of a German building application, which we have to get for all these prototypes, both in regards to wind loads and snow loads, but this skin is also the light modulating and weather protecting envelope, which in this case touches the ground only on one half of the kind of toroidal shape and then sort of forms an 8-meter free spanning opening on the other side. So what is also interesting is that inside this kind of toroidal space can never be perceived in its entirety, which leads to a surprising spatial depth that is further enhanced by the sequence of direct and indirect illumination that results from these undulations of the envelope. So in addition to sort of using these projects as a kind of architectural exploration, we also use them as sort of means of investigating and verifying our design methods. And in this case, we did this by comparing these 4 models. On the top, the design computation model. On the right, the actual sort of finite element material simulation, which is required in order to actually know how the residual stresses that are embedded in the system in the assembly process can actually enhance the structural capacity in regards to wind loads and snow loads. For that, you have to really sort of simulate the bending process. And then the fabrication model, and most importantly, on the bottom right, a kind of scan of the actual pavilion, which was done a couple of times, and then the resultant point clouds were actually algorithmically evaluated by overlaying the critical joint points of the scan with the actual sort of location of the joint points as planned in the digital model. So by comparing the kind of computational model that you can see up here on top and the scan of the pavilion, which is the kind of the lower image, one can really sort of see that the deviations between these 2 models were absolutely minor, and that means that this kind of suggested integration of material behavior and design computation is no longer a kind of idealized goal, but is actually already now quite a feasible proposition. So probably more importantly, I think the project also demonstrates how focusing the computation design process on material behavior rather than geometric shape allows for unfolding performative capacity and material resourcefulness, while at the same time also expanding the design space towards formerly unexplored architectural possibilities. And I think here one can really say that the material is no longer a passive receptor of a kind of design shape, but really an active generator of the design. So in addition to these investigations of how one can actually actively employ material behavior in the design process, we also investigate how we can sort of use digital fabrication not so much as a kind of means of facilitating a kind of preconceived design idea, but rather also to become a kind of driver in the design process. And for that, it's actually very important that one can actually sort of find a way of capturing the actual capacities or, let's say, possibilities of these machines in a kind of rigorous and systematic fashion. And for that, we have investigated a kind of possible transfer of the mathematical concept of so-called morphospaces from theoretical morphology in biology to computation design and fabrication. So what you see here is actually a seminal kind of research. It was conducted by a paleontologist called David Raup in the early 1960s, who actually used already at that time computation to generate shell morphologies based on only actually 3 shape parameters. So these are the kind of shell forms he came up with. But then the kind of seminal moment is when he goes on and he maps these parameters into a 3-dimensional, or he actually establishes a kind of 3-dimensional coordinate system in which each axis actually represents one of the shape parameters. And this kind of space that he opens up with that is sort of the theoretical morphospace that all shell morphologies could take. And then he went on and he mapped into this kind of theoretically possible geometry space the actual sort of shell morphologies as they exist in nature. And by that he made the kind of critical distinction between what is theoretically possible and what physically exists in nature, basically differentiating between the theoretical morphospace and what is called the empirical morphospace. So this is 1960s state of research of biology. By now, theoretical morphology has moved on and uses actually n-dimensional models that are capable of mathematically describing a non-yet existent form. So in the next project, which was again a collaborative undertaking of researchers and students from my institute, the Institute of Jan Knippers, and also other partners from the University of Tübingen, which are part of our competence network biomimetics, investigated how we can actually transfer this idea of morphospaces from theoretical morphology to digital fabrication. And this project actually started with a very basic investigation how we can actually extend or use, for example, a production robot to extend the possibilities of traditional wood jointing techniques. In this case, finger joints, where using a kind of 7-axis, in the end, a kind of 7-axis setup allows you to actually create more complex plate morphologies that can actually be joined in various different angles, but still maintain the key advantage of the traditional finger joint, which is that it doesn't require any additional mechanical fasteners or adhesives to become sort of structurally capable. So based on the specific robotic setup that we wanted to employ, we actually identified 3 critical morphological parameters of these sort of finger jointed blades. And then we sort of set up a kind of specific simulation that allows us to sort of establish the min-max ranges of these morphological parameters. And this allows us to sort of map into the space of what is actually geometrically possible, the kind of machinic morphospace which describes what you can actually produce with this particular machine. So at the bottom, you see the theoretical morphospace of all sort of geometrically possible geometries. In the center, the morphospace of a 6-axis robot, and then on the right side, the kind of morphospace of a 7-axis robot, basically allowing you to mathematically capture the kind of space of, or the design space for these blades. Now, the next challenge is once you have actually a kind of robust method of describing what you can actually produce, how do you now explore this design space in a kind of interesting or meaningful manner? And this brings us to the quote of Julian Vincent, who stated that in biology, material is expensive, but shape is cheap. As of today, the opposite was true in the case of technology. Arguably, if you now have these kind of robotic fabrication technologies at hand, and you know quite specifically how you can actually navigate this space, you can sort of change this paradigm, and you can sort of seek new performance capacities through an adaptation of shape rather than adding surplus material. So for that, you obviously have to understand the very specific behavior of these blade morphologies. And here it's also, again, you don't need to be a kind of professor in structural engineering to understand that these finger joints are very good in withstanding actually shear forces along the edges of the blades, but are very weak in withstanding bending forces, or have no capacity to actually withstand tensile forces. So this poses actually quite a challenge if you want to construct a larger blade morphology or a kind of larger blade structure on a construction scale. But it's interesting to note that there are natural systems that have evolved solutions to exactly this challenge, which, for example, is the blade skeleton of the cent dollar, which consists of discrete polygonal blades that are actually jointed or that are held together by the kind of biological equivalent to a finger joint. So that means that the cent dollar has evolved blade morphologies that are capable of capitalizing the capacity of this joint by actually transferring all the forces that are acting on these cent dollars, and they're quite enormous because they live on the kind of shore face, to translate all these forces into shear forces along the edges. So what we did is we investigated these particular cent dollars with the help of biologists, actually with experts on biomechanics from the University of Tübingen. And with them, we identified 8 relevant biomimetic design principles that govern this performance capacity and captured them in algorithmic design rules that were embedded in a computational process that then enables the designer to explore, on the one hand, the machinic morphospace of what is physically producible, and on the other hand, also capture these biomimetic sort of rules and still leave enough sort of design freedom to make it a kind of highly specific structure in regards to its context. So obviously, the resultant morphological differentiation leads to a high structure performance and quite a distinctive sort of architectural appearance. But in return, it also requires the fabrication of a vast amount of different blades. In this case, more than 850 blades with more than 100,000 different finger joints. And this is possible because we can actually run the robot fabrication setup from the design files through actually custom software that we develop that allows us to topologically sort the blades and then actually derive the robot control code directly from this kind of design information. And as you can nicely see in this video, it's not a kind of trivial kind of machining process based on this kind of 7-axis setup. So the plate is actually mounted onto a turntable that's also robotically controlled. And then it's actually trimmed, which has been done before the video started. And now the robot adds a miter at the edges, and then it cuts the joint actually in one go, for which we had a special tool developed by one of the industry partners, which is able to actually cut at the tip and the flange, which is quite unusual, which then means that the precision of the joint is actually the precision of the tool, which is in the sort of tenths of a millimeter range. It takes about 3 minutes to produce one of these plates. And what is interesting again is that while kind of the design process is quite involving and a kind of substantial sort of intellectual investment, the resulting system is incredibly simple. It's basically a big puzzle that is self-correcting when it's assembled. It really does only fit in one quite precise shape. Actually so precise that we did some unorthodox exercise when assembling it, which this is the way you would never assemble a shell in construction. You'd always have scaffolds, then lay the segments on top, then do your tolerance compensation. If you do it like this and your last piece doesn't fit, there's no way of actually sort of resolving this situation. Anyways, we did it this way, and we are quite happy to see that in the end everything fitted very nicely with deviations of only a couple of millimeters, which was again verified by a 3D scan, which you can see here at the bottom. Actually also the top, which shows you that also these kind of laser scanning technologies now are almost like three-dimensional photographs. So you can go in, that's what we did subsequently, and actually measure every single finger joint to see its deviations. More importantly, I think the resultant sort of lightweight modular wood shell again demonstrates both the structural capacity and the architectural potential of such a system that exclusively consists of extremely thin birch plywood plates that are only connected by these robotically fabricated finger joints. And as the structural performance here results from each element's highly specific response, the entire pavilion with a diameter of more than 12 meters and a height of more than 6 meters could be built using actually only extremely thin plates. So in fact, all of the plates in this pavilion have, again, only a thickness of 6.5 millimeters, which results in a very lightweight and materially efficient structure that manages to enclose 200 cubic meters of space with less than 2 cubic meters of wood. So basically, you could build the entire thing with a kind of stack of wood on that table that would be only that high. So envision what 2 cubic meters of wood are. It's actually really very little. So I think, in a way, this system again, or this kind of prototype, shows how a kind of tectonic richness and a structural capacity don't necessarily need to sort of be in opposition to each other, which is a kind of perception one could have by looking at a lot of contemporary architecture, but that you can actually fuse this kind of possibility for architectural performativity and material performance in a kind of material-oriented design process. So overall, I think the project quite nicely shows how embedding the logics of materialization in such a morphogenetic computation design process really also allows the designer to offset the conventional economics of construction. Here, as mentioned before, a substantial intellectual investment in the design process results in a very simple, cheap, and efficient system that still yields a lot of novel architectural possibilities. What is interesting about this system is that it also captured the imagination of the Ministry of Forestry in Germany, and we are now in the kind of got funding actually to build a much larger wooden shell, a permanent wooden shell as a result of this project, which will complete in the sort of April next year, which I think is interesting that these projects become not only kind of a sort of don't only allow sort of an architectural speculation, but they also can become sort of instigators for actually permanent architecture. It's also interesting to note that this sort of morphology of the cent dollar with this kind of discrete building parts is something that is actually very rare in nature, and that you usually find exactly the opposite, which are structures that are very continuous and that are actually performative due to the kind of the local differentiation of one continuous material structure. So the third chapter actually focuses on that, how you can actually sort of begin to think about material structure as something that cannot be so easily distinguished any longer, and with that you obviously shift towards a kind of paradigm of composite construction. So this is what we explored in the third project I would like to show you, which is really that different to the previous pavilion or the previous project, which was a shell that was built up from discrete elements. In this project, we really aim for almost the opposite approach of an entirely continuous shell in which the material structure is constructed and differentiated in its continuity through robotic fabrication. This is again a collaborative project between architects, structural engineers, biologists, and actually process engineers in this case. And it's interesting to note that there are a lot of biological examples that are like this, but we choose the American lobster because there's a lot of biological research on this one that is really behaving like that. So the exoskeleton of this lobster, which at the first glance appears as relatively monolithic, reveals under the microscope a high level of differentiation, which is actually of the structure, which is organized across several levels of hierarchy. And although everything is essentially one composite material in this exoskeleton, which is basically a kind of chitin-protein composite, the build-up and orientation of the fibrous microstructure results in considerably different material behavior. This is kind of the engineering diagram of a kind of lobster dinner experience. So if you ever had a lobster, you know that, for example, the pincher claw or the crusher claw are extremely stiff and strong, whereas the tail is very flexible, but it's all the same material. It's just locally differentiated due to the fiber layout and the composition of the matrix. So in collaboration with the biologists in Tübingen, the researchers and students carefully investigated different parts of the lobster shell under the microscope in order to investigate how the different sort of fibrous arrangements in the cuticula actually have an impact on the mechanical behavior of these exoskeletons. And because sort of these natural fiber composite materials are conceptually quite close to synthetic composite materials, we at the same time investigated sort of new or advanced ways of working with, for example, glass fiber or carbon fiber composite materials. As for example, the 3DL technology, which is not that new anymore, I think it's 10 or 12 years old, where you know that high performance sails for American's cup yachts are actually produced in a way that the fibers or the filaments are actually laid according to the force floor, and these kind of fiber layup processes allow you to sort of orient every single fiber in a direction in which it will actually ultimately receive the maximum stress. Obviously, it also becomes clear that this is not a viable construction technology for architecture, because that means all these fiber layup systems require a comprehensive mold, which means that if you want to build something, you first have to build the building as a mold, and then you actually lay the fibers on top. So what we did is we tried to investigate possibilities of reducing the molds to a minimum sort of linear scaffold on which then the fibers, an initial fiber layer is laid, which becomes the lost or embedded mold for the actually structural carbon fiber. So here you can see this robotic process, which is a kind of 1 to 5 scale prototype, where the kind of glass fiber surfaces are laid initially, and then they turn into the kind of scaffold which receive ultimately the carbon fibers, which receives the carbon fibers. So having established the basic robot programming logics, which in this case is not trivial because you don't program a machine path according to the geometry that the building element has, but according to a path that the tool needs to take in order to pre-stress the fibers in the right way when they ultimately reach this situation. It's conceptually very different to the milling process that we showed before. But once you have mastered sort of this kind of robotic filament winding process, you can begin to sort of investigate what different material behaviors you can actually yield from this process. So we did a lot of samples and evaluated them in collaboration with the structural engineers at the ITKE. And based on these sort of different properties or material characteristics that you can get, and the kind of logic and constraints of the fabrication process, we were able to develop a kind of initial fibrous system in which, as in the biological example, there are different regions of fiber direction and density, as for example, a highly dense and a unidirectional fiber arrangement at the support points where all the forces concentrate, or a more helicoidal fibrous setup, which is the kind of surfaces that have no structure, have a minor structural purpose, but are mainly there as kind of a space-making division, as in the lobster shell. So obviously, here design is very much related to the fabrication process. So we developed a kind of design syntax that allows one to explore the possibilities of this fabrication process, which is not trivial in this case, because the blend geometry is something that only kind of gradually emerges in the production process, because you have a lot of fiber-fiber interactions. So you lay your first fiber surface, and then the next fiber surface changes the geometry of that. And this happens until the last fiber is laid, which means that you have to simulate the fiber layup process for the entire fabrication. Which in this case was really crucial, also because the pre-stress with which the fibers are laid on the scaffold actually determined quite a bit the geometry and the kind of proper bonding between the different layers. So this is the fabrication setup that we developed for the actual manufacturing of the pavilion, which is a kind of relatively big industrial robot that is connected to a turntable that spins this temporary scaffold that we made from steel, which can be adapted to different geometries by these timber parts. And then we used a robot to actually scan the scaffold, adjusted the kind of computational fabrication model to shift then to the actual production, which is a kind of wet fiber winding process. So the fibers initially run through a resin bath, and then they're actually laid onto the scaffold by the robot. So here you can see the actual production process, which obviously radically differs from other construction processes. Here, instead of an assembly of parts, the entire structure is wound from one continuous fiber. And in this process, the shell is built up initially of successive layers of glass fiber, which, as mentioned before, provide the space-making surfaces and are at the same time the lost mold. And then the kind of structural carbon fiber is laid onto that. And you can nicely see how the kind of structural glass fiber changes the hyperbolic paraboloid geometry of the underlying glass fiber. And then this kind of resin-saturated structure is built up in layers and cures over the run of the production process so that it turns into one continuous structure. You can see that there's a bit of human quality control happening inside, which is not a nice job, actually. You have tripping resin onto you the entire time. But it's kind of conceptually a fully automized process. And it's also interesting to note that the entire production time for the pavilion was only 120 hours. So the final pavilion consists of more than 45 miles of robotically laid carbon and glass fiber, but it's only approximately 4 millimeters thin at its kind of thickest part. So it is extremely lightweight and enables quite an amazing level of transparency and intricacy of the resulting surfaces, particularly when you see it from the inside. So in a way, synthesizing the capability of the machine with building up the structure itself, the transparent glass fiber surfaces and the black carbon fiber rowings really allow perceiving the logic of the differentiated fibers organization within this translucent envelope, all forming one continuously constructed materiality. There's not a single additional element here. No nuts, no bolts, no nothing. It's just glass and carbon fiber rowings. So I think, again, here the kind of construction logic establishes both a super thin, highly performative skin and quite a kind of novel repertoire for architectural tectonics, which in many ways allows to overcome the exuberance that is so emblematic for many digital designs. Here, the kind of synthesis of novel modes of computation design, robotic fabrication, and also structural simulation enables the exploration of a kind of new repertoire of architecture possibilities while still being very, very efficient with the employed material resources. Currently, we're working on the kind of next carbon fiber project, which is not completed yet, which actually takes this concept further by looking at a kind of modular system that one can also wind with 2 robots without actually any scaffold in between. That's what I'm going to show next year, I guess. So the final chapter is about material performance, which is if you obviously enter into the kind of idea or the kind of domain of beginning to construct your own materials with the kind of distinction between structure and material beginning to blur, you also can begin to actually explore sort of novel capacities that are embedded even in very straightforward and mundane materials. So I will return for one last time to wood because we have investigated in quite a number of projects over the last 7 years actually the possibility to understand wood as a kind of climate responsive material. And this is possible because, as you may know, wood is hygroscopic. So in addition to being actually a natural fibrous composite, which has a highly anisotropic behavior, which means it behaves, for example, very, very different in the radial section or in the tangential section, it is also hygroscopic, which means that it absorbs and desorbs water molecules from the atmosphere, and by that it actually changes its dimension. So this is a kind of phenomenon that is usually called the dimensional instability of wood, which is perceived as a kind of disadvantage or deficiency of the material. And in fact, we spend more than 70% of the energy in wood processing on trying to prevent or suppress this inherent behavior from actually happening. As you can see here, this is done by kiln drying, which means that you actually put the wood into some sort of large kiln and you reduce the moisture content to something like 7 or 8%, and by that you try to stabilize the wood dimensionally. And one could actually argue that we have almost 3,000 years of craftsmanship trying to work against this material behavior in order to make your parquet floors not becoming wobbly or your kind of wooden drawers not to sort of jam. So what we try to do with these projects is to do exactly the opposite, sort of explore this inherent climate responsiveness by wood as a kind of possibility for rethinking a kind of weather responsive architecture. And there are, again, natural examples of such lignin-based structures that are behaving like this, a kind of one that you probably know as the spruce cone, which grows on the tree in a moist state, and then it falls off the tree, and once the kind of microclimate conditions reach a suitable level of low relative humidity, the cone opens completely by itself. It's also interesting to note that this opening process happens when the cone is already a dead plant organ, so it actually doesn't actually require any metabolic energy to work. So in a sense, the cone has found a way of actually employing the kind of dimensional instability or the kind of differential dimensional change in order to sort of enable a shape change of the scales, or of the cone. So what we did already kind of a couple of years ago is try to use the same principle and construct a composite material element with that, using actually wood as the smart layer that behaves in a very similar manner. So you get this kind of bimetal effect where the wood actually swells and shrinks And that allows you to be that can be translated into a shape change that allows a kind of correspondence between the shape the element takes and the relative humidity level that you can see on the hygrometer here on the left. So over the last couple of years, we have developed ways of how we can physically program that behavior. So although what you see here are two samples that are made from exactly the same material, exactly the same sort of structural makeup, and they respond to exactly the same humidity conditions, they behave in exactly the opposite manner. One closes with a kind of increase in relative humidity and the other one opens. So due to kind of this integral computational design and fabrication process, one can literally physically program this hygroscopic actuation behavior. And we have tested that in a number of full-scale prototypes. We've done actually a number of laboratory tests by now, and we have conducted more than 2.5 years of long-term testing of this system on the rooftop of our university building, exposing the system actually to an external environment. And we haven't actually fully evaluated all the data yet, but for the first couple for the first year, we can actually say that the system performed faultlessly, sort of opening and closing with every weather change in a very robust and reliable fashion, which you can see here. So in the meantime, we had the chance to sort of develop this veneer composite system further based on a commission we received from the Centre Pompidou for an installation for their permanent collection. And in this case, we found it interesting that in many ways the Centre Pompidou embodies kind of the architectural opposite to our approach. In fact, the entire building celebrates the very technology that maintains the stable interior climate as one of its key architectural features. So most of the stuff that you can see on this image is actually the air conditioning, which becomes sort of almost like the kind of decisive architectural language for this building. So we thought it's interesting to insert into this what is arguably one of the most controlled interiors in the world, always maintaining 50% relative humidity, 21 degree Celsius temperature, to insert a kind of glass box in which we simulate the changes of the external climate of Paris, especially in regards to the humidity changes. And in this way, the kind of material-sensitive morphology that we insert in this kind of glass box becomes a kind of visual device through which the visitor can actually perceive these relative humidity changes that form part of our everyday life, but are hardly ever consciously perceived. So here the actual geometry or morphology of the system is derived based on a simulation of the heterogeneous distribution of humidity within this controlled environment. So you can nicely see in the simulation that our project partners Transolar did for this installation that even within such a controlled environment as the glass box, the humidity levels are highly heterogeneous. And that becomes the driver for the sort of computation process that derives this particular geometry. So within the glass case, as mentioned, the climate corresponds to an accelerated database of the relative humidity changes in outside Paris, to which the system continuously responds, providing a visual experience of the subtle humidity fluctuations that form part of our everyday experience, but are hardly ever sort of something that we are very sensitive to. It's very interesting that we're very sensitive to temperature, perceiving actually minute changes in temperature, but we are actually not very sensitive to humidity, where we actually only really have a kind of body experience if we go from one extreme to the other. So this becomes almost like a haptic visual device in order to make these environmental dynamics tangible. So a mere increase in relative humidity triggers the system to open, and although there are really only very simple wood and composite elements, the system embodies the capacity to sense, actuate, and respond with no need for any additional mechanical or electronic equipment or the supply of external energy. quite recently we had the chance to sort of investigate that system also on a kind of within a kind of small architectural application based on the commission of the Frac Center in Orléans for a kind of traveling pavilion for their permanent collection, which sort of allowed us to investigate the possibilities of constructing such a weather-responsive skin that actually remains fully closed, in this case at relatively high ambient humidity levels, but then sort of opens with a decrease in relative humidity. So it's kind of exactly opposite behavior as the Centre Pompidou installation, but in this case it's more about actually having a kind of functional architectural skin. And in many ways this project allowed us to synthesize different research aspects. One of the key requirements for the project was that it's a traveling pavilion that needs to fit within the constraints of a small container, as you can see on the right. So it's a modular system in which the kind of elastically bent wooden skin becomes a load-bearing structure into which these kind of climate-responsive apertures are embedded. So what we actually did is we developed this idea of the elastic forming of wooden systems further by actually investigating a kind of conical elastic forming process as opposed to the first project that I showed you, which was a kind of linear elastic forming. So basically you can simulate the bending behavior of a planar wood surface like that is connected through these puzzle joints and then actually takes on this kind of conical surface shape, which forms the inner and the outer skin of actually a sandwich panel, which has a layer of insulation on the inside. So, and this is then sort of robotically trimmed to achieve the required position for such a kind of modular system. So initially the robot is employed to measure the sort of form-found modules, and then a computation model sort of adjusts the fabrication data for the sawing process and actually the milling of the kind of foam core of these elements. So here, obviously, one decisive factor for both the kind of architecture experience, but also the kind of structural coherency is the precision of these conical shapes. So we actually scanned some of those self-formed, elastically self-formed conical shapes, and we are very happy to see that actually deviations between the plant geometry in this case and the kind of self-formed geometry are really, really minor. So here you can see this, the mean deviation between the geometry as planned and the geometry that the wood takes is 0.5 millimeter. And there are hardly any pieces that have a bigger deviation than 1.5 millimeters across the entire surface. And this sort of visually registers in the precision of the panels, or it's not just panels, actually the entire structure being assembled, where you have a consistent 6 millimeter gaps of these load-bearing wooden skins in which the decisive feature is implemented, which is obviously the weather-sensitive apertures that are fully open on a sunny day, but once the weather actually changes and the relative humidity increases, they automatically close, again, without the need for any additional mechanical or electronic control or the need for the supply of external energy. So I think here one can really say that the material itself is the machine. Thank you.
Yeah. So a few questions, anyone?
Gentleman over there.
Wait for Mike, actually.
It's interesting. Oh, thank you for a lovely presentation. It was very good. But it's interesting that you talk about biomimicry, but in the context of using manufactured materials, and that we don't see any. Even the performative wood that you showed us last is still manufactured in a certain way before it's a composite material. It's not as found in nature and used as such. Have you got any intentions, or have you had any reflections on the use of natural materials as found?
Maybe just as a clarification, we talk about biomimicry, or in German it's called bionics, because it is actually a translation of principles from nature into technology. If we would work with natural materials or synthetic biology, it wouldn't be biomimetics, it would be biotechnology, which I think is a bit of a difference. I think it's interesting that possibly there is, or is already happening, that there is a kind of synthesis of, let's say, materials that are alive and materials that are constructed or produced is beginning to emerge, where we have a lab actually just down the road in Stuttgart that are 3D printing human tissue. On the other hand, I think it's also interesting to see that there's still a bit of mileage in relatively old materials as wood, which is kind of semi-natural. Well, in the last, there is a kind of, the intelligent part is actually the wood as grown. We put it into a composite sort of element, but this is actually the dumb part. But I would argue that for the moment we are still very much interested in seeing what we can do with materials that are actually manufactured, produced, or grown and then turned into construction materials, relatively basic construction materials on the one hand, more advanced technological materials like the carbon fiber composites, because there's still so much to explore with these materials before we venture into your proto-cell synthetic biology architecture that I think obviously there is a kind of, that is on the horizon, but I would say we find this approach more interesting in the kind of immediate future.
First of all, congratulations, because your research is really amazing. I have a question about the scale. If we are going to change the scale of this object, what changes both in terms of digital fabrication and in terms of behavior of the material? Because I think that this material, this activation of the material, of course, work really well when we are going to work on a small element, but when we are going to activate maybe a bigger element of a cell, require more energy that maybe the material by itself is not able to do. But maybe I am wrong, so it's just to know. And about the digital fabrication, I don't know, maybe if we are going to build something of bigger, or how is your plan? Maybe always panelization, discretization of this element. Thank you.
Maybe there are two answers to your question. The first one addresses, I think in the first one you referred to the scalar issue of the responsive elements. This is, I think, an interesting situation where these systems make us also challenge our own preconceptions, that if things need to become architectural, that always automatically means that they have to become bigger. I think this is not the case with these systems. What we find very interesting is that one can actually think about a very robust convertible roof that is made actually from very small components, but loads of them, which increases the kind of distributed control, it increases the responsiveness, it increases actually the robustness of the system. And this is sort of, I think this is the kind of a principle that nature would employ, sort of a lot of small movements rather than the grand movement that hardly ever works when we come to large convertible roof structures. The way we usually pitch that when we write a funding application is that we say, look at stadium roofs. The biggest convertible roof is a kind of membrane roof in Frankfurt, worked twice, then the company went bankrupt, and now it's always open because these are big, like Wembley Stadium here. Now it's a 150-meter long steel plate moving up and down, a kind of incredibly fragile, high maintenance, high cost solution to something that you could actually address with a kind of small, you could actually achieve exactly the same thing, natural ventilation, direct UV light on the pitch with a system that is actually small but many sort of adaptive movements. So I think what I try to say beyond this kind of pragmatics is that what is interesting about these systems is that they also allow us to sometimes rethink what an appropriate size is, because these things tend to be always one-to-one scale. So it's not about just scaling up in that sense. Probably doesn't mean sort of increase in size, but increase in number. When it comes to your second question, with the digital manufacturing, I think what is interesting is that a lot of these technologies are beginning to be in place. So I told you that we have now, we're just building a large, and this is actually a relatively large permanent wood shell, which has a almost 20-meter diameter, from robotically fabricated wood plates, which was instigated by this project, but now actually brings together, on the one hand, the sort of robot manufacturers, a professional timber manufacturer, and us working together on seeing how you can actually transfer what we do within the academic realm into the realm of building construction, which I think is definitely an interesting perspective for these things, and show that initially I would say that the challenging part is sort of the intellectual way of thinking about these technologies in a different way, rather than sort of just a facilitator for some sort of exuberant, exotic architect's dream as a kind of generator for something that is actually very specific in its architectural sort of quality or expression, but at the same time is also aligned with the kind of materialization logics, fabrication constraints, and the kind of capacities of the materials that we employ. And by that sort of, and this was sort of what I tried to say throughout the entire, but that this is kind of the message I want to convey. This is actually, I think, a very exciting moment, because it allows us to sort of resolve this discrepancy between what we now think is architecturally performative and, on the other hand, what is the kind of material and structural performance, that these things can actually coexist rather than work against each other.
I have a small question. You've presented all the projects as a seamless process where everything fits perfectly together. I would like if you could speak a bit about failure or the mistakes that you've encountered, the things that you learn from, more than the perfect, seamless.
If I would tell you about all the problems, we would still be here tomorrow, you know. So, obviously, these things are not by any means seamless, and sort of this is a development process that sort of goes from one hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion to the next one. And when I tell you that the fabrication of the carbon fiber pavilion took 120 hours, this is sort of the net fabrication time. It actually took half a year to build the thing, because this is a kind of continuous learning process, and that's also what I find interesting, and that's also what lends it to become sort of academic research rather than sort of just a kind of construction process, is that while you go along, you actually uncover constantly new interesting questions and also new interesting possibilities. So I don't want to sort of give you the impression that these things are seamless. They are actually highly disruptive, failure prone, problematic, but then again, most of the problems turn into interesting possibilities for subsequent research. So one of the problems we encounter, very straightforward one, is that it's damn difficult to transport something that is, it's conceptually interesting if something is with 8-meter diameter is continuous, but it's very difficult to transport. Well, you need a helicopter. That's the only way to, even though it's only weighing 300 kilograms and can be carried by a couple of students. This is something we only realized when we had to block the roads to get it from the building site to the actual site we are supposed to erect it. And that's why we, for example, we now investigate how we can actually modularize this idea of carbon fiber filament winding, which is very much, that's not sort of intrinsic to the kind of all the biological systems that we investigate, because they're always entirely continuous. So it's actually throwing up an interesting problem, how you resolve the joint between composite elements without sort of the state of construction is actually just put a bolt through. And that's what we obviously really try to avoid, because that's against this whole idea of fibrous continuity.
Your project seems, sorry, seem to have a very high level of integration, and I can see you have graduate students working together with PhD students, but also other faculties like engineering or biology. How does this complex organization unfolds during the year?
It's a kind of very simple structure. Actually, we run that. So we have the PhD students who are all investigating particular aspects. So these are not PhD projects. They all have particular aspects of PhD projects. And then we run a design studio that investigates that. And the design studio is actually architects, engineers, and biologists. And from that, we sort of develop ideas for these kind of constructions, and then they are constantly informed by the research of the PhD students. And this coalesces into these kind of prototypes. So it's really, I think the key is that researchers and students are working on eye level, and it's kind of a team where all the kind of different disciplines also have let's say, also have a kind of mutual respect for each other. It's not that the architects are leading that. It's kind of, from the beginning, it's a truly sort of multidisciplinary approach where neither the kind of researchers are leading, nor the architects are leading. It's kind of a common undertaking, which is occasionally also very difficult, honestly. Not on the kind of social level, but more on the methodological level, because what you have here is two bottom-up design processes competing. One is the kind of biomimetic one, so looking into biology and finding interesting material structures. And on the other hand, also looking at fabrication processes and how they sort of establish new design possibilities. Then sometimes actually methodologically quite difficult to actually make these things align in a meaningful manner. This is actually also what I would say is the main challenge, that on the one hand, we have the possibility to understand biology in a different way. On the other hand, we have all these fascinating fabrication processes, but to make these things sort of exist in on a certain level of synergy is something that's actually one of the key sensibilities that an architect should probably sort of learn from these kind of investigations.
Last question, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask regarding your last project. Does the responsive ability of the material reduce as time passes by, as it is a biological organism? And I'm asking this in order to make to compare biological materials with industrial materials.
That is the kind of a very similar question that the curator of the Centre Pompidou asked, because the last thing he wants to do is that this thing stops working at one point, and he spent a hell lot of money on getting it actually. But the interesting thing is that similar to this structure experienced the same problem, is that wood actually creeps. So there's creep in wood, which means that, and you know that if you take a piece of wood, you bend it, and you hold it for a moment, you can actually bend it a little bit further. this is something that affects this system, but it also affects the composite responsive material. So what you actually have to do is very funny, is you have to actually exercise it regularly. If you leave it for long periods in a kind of very dry humidity and it's actually curled up, the internal anatomy of the piece changes, and actually it takes a while to recover its responsive ability. So it is actually, in that sense, it's fragile if you keep it in very low humidity situations for a long time. So inactivity in this case is more problematic than actually having it moving. And this thing at the Pompidou changes every hour. So basically you can perceive, because there's a kind of relation between the relative humidity and temperature. So every night relative humidity usually increases. And that's why in the Pompidou piece, 1 hour equals a day. So you have one cycle usually per hour. And it has has worked absolutely faultlessly for half a year now, or longer, more than a year now.
Can I add a comment? If indeed you stop doing that, curators of museums in the world will delight. We've got pieces which go back hundreds of thousands of years, and the biggest problem is indeed the fact that they keep moving because the sweat is training. Hence, the idea of having this massive air conditioning systems where you want to keep temperature, humidity at a fixed rate, is because this wood can do this kind of thing for thousands of years without any problem. So long as it doesn't degrade bacterially, as long as it's not affected by other organisms, there's no reason why we don't carry on doing it.
I think the one biologist, actually Thomas Speck, once said for the cone it would be 10 times more difficult to stop moving than actually keep moving. So they tested a spruce cone for 3,000 cycles, and there's no fatigue whatsoever. And it's funny because the biological function is fulfilled once the cone opens, because then the seeds are released. There's no reason for the cone to keep sort of opening and closing, but it's just a materially embedded behavior.
Okay, please join me in thanking